Yeah, we can transition from talking about a little bit of paradise down here in Florida to the to the plagues of the apocalypse.
Exactly.
That's because that's what we get, in Revelation 8. So, this chapter is the beginning of the vision of the six trumpets. All right, and the sequence of those is kicked off in the first verse of Revelation 8:1, which is where the Lamb, of course, who we know, identified with that as Jesus, according to Revelation 5 and 6 and so on. It's kicked off by the Lamb's opening of the seventh and final seal on the scroll. So, for those who are familiar with Revelation, or at least vaguely familiar, you get this divine council scene in Revelation 4 and 5 that we spent a couple weeks talking about. And in the hand of God, who is seated on the throne, is this scroll. The scroll has seven seals on it. And we're actually going to return to the issue of the scroll isn't really opened until all of the seals are broken, because just think about it. Think about the real life equivalent or side of the metaphor. I mean, if you might have seven seals on the thing, but if six of them are off and the seventh is still there, you're still not able to open the scroll. That might actually be a factor interpretively here in the sequence beginning. But once that last seal is broken, now we get six trumpets, and these are going to be judgments. Okay, at least that spill on into chapter 9. You're going to get a seventh later on, but again, for sort of a discrete unit, 8 and 9 sort of go together. They operate in tandem. So in the space of those two chapters, we're going to get these six, trumpets, these judgments. And so we might as well just jump right in. I'm going to read the first 6 verses because that's really what we're going to cover today. And then next time we're going to hit the trumpet judgments themselves, because they have at least the first 4 of them have a very obvious overlap with the plagues, right, back in the Exodus story. So those 6, are going to be covered in the next episode. And so this is going to be sort of set up for that. But anybody who looks at the chapter is going to know that, boy, this sounds very obviously like the plagues on Egypt at the Exodus. And we'll get to that. And that's important because, again, we're focused on the use of the Old Testament when it comes to the content of Revelation. So let's just read the first 6 verses. Again, that's what we'll hit today. When the Lamb opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. Then I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. And another angel came and stood at the altar with a golden censer, and he was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rose before God from the hand of the angel. Then the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar and threw it on the earth. And there were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. Now the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared to blow them. That's the end of the 6th verse, and of course then that starts off the sequence. So the first thing we hit here is kind of obvious. There was silence in heaven. Like, what's that all about? There are actually several interpretive options for this, all of which have been offered by scholars, and those scholars have proposed some connection with the Old Testament. So we're just going to hit the options real quickly here. There are several of these. Number one, Tonstad in his Revelation commentary. And this is a new resource that was actually recommended by a listener, and I went out and got it and I've looked through it. It's actually got some really interesting things to say, because this is an author that actually recognizes divine counsel stuff in the book, which I think is why it was recommended to me specifically. But Tonstad in his Revelation commentary, it's part of the Paideia commentary series on the New Testament. Tonstad offers a couple of interpretations. The first one that he jumps into is that the silence is the silencing of prayers. And in this category, he writes in his commentary about R.H. Charles, suggested this. And Charles, the quote from Charles's old Revelation commentary, and that name might be familiar to those who are into the Book of Enoch. It's the same guy, R.H. Charles. He spent a lot of time in the Book of Revelation. It's apocalyptic literature, and the Book of Enoch, which is also apocalyptic literature. But Charles wrote, "The praises of the highest order of angels are hushed, that the prayers of all the suffering saints on earth may be heard before the throne," unquote. So again, this is just one option. And Tonstad, again, goes through a few of these, and this is where I just decided to start. In this scenario, there's an enforced silence in heaven so that the prayers of the people suffering on earth don't get drowned out. Well, I mean, the text doesn't actually say that, but there you go. Charles proposed this view in 1920. Again, you can find this sort of thing in apocalyptic literature. Certainly you find, prayers both in terms of what's being done in heaven and on earth. In the book of Revelation, you find that. And again, this is just the way he takes the silence. So it's the silencing of prayers, because, what else could there be going on that needs silencing? And so he opts for this, the prayers that have been mentioned up to this point. Plus, he's going to associate it with the incense language, because, again, that was language used in the Old Testament to symbolize the ascent of prayers to heaven, the burning of the incense and so on and so forth. So it's not like a far-fetched view or just a stab in the dark. It's just one of several, and that's where Charles was at, and so Tonstad mentions it. But Tonstad actually prefers a different option, which, again, I don't know how how the audience is going to think about this. Again, we're just going through the options. This probably really wouldn't occur to anybody. And I have to be honest with you, I don't think this is that persuasive compared to some of the other options. But his own view, Tonstad's own view, number 2, this is our second option, is that the silence is really about the Lamb. That might sound a little weird, but here's how he puts it. He says, "Silence is the most striking feature of the Old Testament scene that has the greatest bearing on how best to understand the silence here in Revelation 8:1. And then he quotes Isaiah 52, 14 and 15. And this is, I would assume this is his own translation. So those verses say, "Just as there were many who were astonished at him," this is the suffering servant. This is Isaiah 52 at the end, going on into Isaiah 53. "Just as there were many who were astonished at him, so marred was his appearance beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of mortals. So he shall startle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which had not been told them they shall see, and that which they had not heard they shall contemplate." So he says, his argument is basically, look, Isaiah 52, these 2 verses, depict a silencing, the silence of shock and awe in the face of an unexpected discovery. Of course, in this case, it's the identity of the suffering servant. So again, what's the cause of the silence back in Isaiah 52? They were astonished at him. And of course, this is the identity of the messianic servant, who everybody thought was, beaten and defeated and so on and so forth. Well, it turns out, no, not at all. And so he says, when this detail is applied to the mystery in Revelation, the cause for the silence will not be the events that are disclosed or the events still to be disclosed, whether the terrors of judgment or the prayers of the saints. He says, in fact, the silence is going to be due to the Lamb in the middle of the throne. When people, when the people in the scene, or at least those who are causing the suffering, are awakened to the fact that the Lamb that was slain is now the holder of power, the Lamb in the midst of the throne, that's going to be the eye-opener. He says, when human and cosmic reality is held up to what he is and what he reveals God to be, they are going to be at a loss for words. So again, this is his interpretation. I don't know that there's any real specific, other than the feature of shutting the mouth. There's really no textual connection between Revelation 8 back to Isaiah 52. But again, a lot of these are going to be they're going to be of like nature. There's going to be some loose sort of association. But again, just going through the options, this is where Tonstad lands and the one he prefers. Third option. Owen says that silence signals the eschatological return to primordial silence. In other words, the world shall be turned back to primeval silence for 7 days as it was at the first beginnings, at least according to some pseudepigraphical literature in 4th Ezra. the idea is that this is a reversion to the chaos that preceded the first creation. And again, if all this apocalyptic stuff, all this plague imagery is going to happen to the earth, it's as though the earth is being sort of taken apart. It's destroyed. It's Ragnarok, to borrow the Norse language that might be more familiar to listeners. Everything's going to get destroyed and decreated, and so that's the silence that is in view. At least On says this is worth considering. But then he's honest. He says the weakness of this view lies in the fact that the text says nothing about a reversion to the silence that preceded creation. So that, again, here you go. Yeah, on the one hand, you could take this trajectory. Oh, well, that makes sense. An apocalypse decreates the earth. Oh, that sounds kind of good. But there's actually no specific textual hook back into like Genesis 1, 2, or something like that. It's just sort of a supposition. It's an interpretive effort. So On is honest about that, but then he goes on and he actually has a different preference. He entertains that one for a while, and then where he lands would be number 4 for us. Silence must be maintained, he says, in the presence of God, particularly during certain phases of the liturgy. So what he's going to say is, look, we've got all this incense thing, we've got an altar reference, we've got prayers, and so he looks at Revelation 8 as being part of a liturgical process, a ritual liturgical process. And then he takes that back to the Old Testament and observes that in Psalm 62:1, Habakkuk 2:20, you have some Second Temple texts like the Epistle of Aristeas 95. You have priests in the Temple of Jerusalem do what they do in complete silence. Like that, it's actually noted that priests were doing what they were doing, but they maintained quiet while they were doing it. And so On draws attention to these kinds of references and says, well, we have some kind of ritual thing going on in Revelation 8, and so the silence is just there by those in the presence of God offering up the incense and burning it and all this sort of stuff. That's what the silence refers to. And interestingly enough, Malina lands here as well, just because of these Old Testament parallels. Owen thinks this is the most convincing view because, quote, silence was very probably maintained during the incense offering in the Jerusalem temple cult. And then he quotes some rabbinic texts. He quotes the Testament of Adam 1:12 for that. So this is, again, where he lands. He sees the liturgy, and then he knows, again, enough of the literature to think that, hey, just like when they were doing stuff in the temple, the priests would be silent. Similar things are happening here, and that must be the silence. Okay, so that's the 4th view. The 5th, and this is represented by Beale, and again, I'll be honest and just say I think this one just makes the most sense, or at the least seems to hook more deeply and more securely back into the Old Testament. He says that silence is basically an appalled silence at the final judgment of the world. Now, what he means by this, it doesn't necessarily have to be a response to the judgment rendered, like after all these judgments play out. That's not when the silence happens. It doesn't happen after the judgments happen. It happens essentially when they become known, when the 7th seal is broken, and then these trumpets, are, at least the scroll is open, and you would be led to believe that when the scroll is open, that what ensues in chapter 8 and chapter 9 with these trumpet judgment, that's sort of the content of the scroll. When that becomes known, there's just this appalled silence at what's going to happen to the world. There's just this shock. So Beale writes this. He says, silence is used in a mundane, non-theological manner, especially in contexts where someone has chosen not to speak. But the Old Testament also associates silence with divine judgment. Idolaters who die abide in silence, Psalm 115:17. Those who persecute God's people are judged by God and consequently sit in silence in Sheol, Psalm 31:17. There will be a primeval silence at the end of history, so Beale actually loops in the primeval idea here. When all the earth's inhabitants die immediately before the final judgment, then he gives us this 4th Ezra 7:30 quote, 4th Ezra 6:39, just like Owen did when he discussed this. Beale continues and says, Babylon and Israel are silent because of God's judgment against them in Isaiah 47:5, Ezekiel 27:32, Amos 8:2 and 3, Lamentations 2:10 and 11, And likewise in 1 Maccabees 1:3, quote, the earth was quiet before, unquote, Alexander after he defeated his enemies. An overt eschatological hope is formulated whereby the wicked are silenced in darkness because the Lord will judge the ends of the earth. That's 1 Samuel 2:9 and 10. So you can see this has some fairly obvious or fairly secure Old Testament roots. But Beale goes on and says, especially relevant are Habakkuk 2:20 and Zechariah 2:13, in which the Lord is pictured as being in his holy temple in heaven, and that's where he's at in the Revelation scene, from which he executes judgment on the ungodly, that is, on Babylon. In Habakkuk 2 and Zechariah 2, the context is Babylon. Of course, Babylon is going to become a factor later in the book of Revelation as the enemy. And so Beale is like, look, the setting's the same. The name Babylon is used, for the one upon whom God is going to take judgment, and so on and so forth. So he sees sort of a clear path back to these two passages. And he continues and says that this temple is in heaven is to be assumed from other Old Testament texts, for example, Ezekiel 1 and Jewish apocalyptic texts, and is in fact evident from Habakkuk 3:3 through 6 and Zechariah 2:13 all the way to chapter 3, verse 2. The response or anticipated response to the judgment in these two texts is that, quote, all the earth and all flesh stand in silent awe. And then he has a couple cross references here, Isaiah 23:2 and Isaiah 41:1 through 5. Jewish commentators affirmed that the Song of Moses, which is Deuteronomy 32, which predominantly predicts the judgment of Israel because of idolatry, caused the whole creation to respond in silence. Let me just stop there. Now, again, those are Jewish commentators. The Deuteronomy 32 doesn't say that, but it's kind of interesting that this gets looped in, to the discussion by virtue of, rabbinical thought about these other texts, about how judgment, will produce this appalled silence. Okay. Back to Beale. He says, temple imagery is evoked again in Zephaniah 1:7, where people are to, quote, be silent, unquote, because God is about to slay them like a cultic sacrifice. Also Zephaniah 1:11, quote, all the people of Canaan will be silenced, unquote. These three announcements of judgment from the minor prophets are perceived by their writers as cosmic eschatological expectations, as implied by the pregnant word all. And then again, he has some other cross references. So Beale winds up and says, the silence in Revelation 8:1 is probably drawn from this Old Testament background. This means that it cannot be taken as emptiness, but it represents judgment or, impending judgment. That's the end of Beale. I think that makes sense. I think he marshals enough evidence to sort of take our minds that way. And when it plays out, it fits. Okay, I think it just does more justice to Old Testament context than some of these other views. And I kind of like the primordial element as well. So I appreciate that Beale brought that in. So again, let's loop in our earlier observation, which was from an earlier episode as well, that you don't really know what's in the scroll until the last seal is broken. Again, Owen had pointed that out earlier. And so the contents of the scroll can only be, seen once this last seal is broken. And the contents of the scroll are essentially the rest of the book in terms of the judgment. So that's like Revelation 8:2 all the way through 22, verse 5. I mean, essentially, once this last seal is broken, we find out what's going to happen. It's the apocalypse. Okay, it's the apocalypse. It's the day of the Lord judgment. All this sort of stuff. And so, again, the silence happens before all that. So it's once it's sort of revealed what God's actually going to do, and the horror of the judgment. That's what produces the silence. And to loop in the decreation idea that it's going to be returned to chaos, and then God's going to reorder it into a new Eden, just like He did in Genesis 1. Okay, that is the kind of mirroring and bookending that makes a lot of sense, at least to me. That again, which is why I appreciate Beale bringing the primeval silence back in here. So there's no specific text that goes from 8:1 back into like Genesis 1:2. That's true. But the result, and again, if you look at Revelation 8:2 through 22:5, here's the decreation. Here's the descent back into chaos by virtue of God's judgment happening. And then what's left of the book is this recreation into a new Eden. Right? If you go back then and look at the first Eden, well, prior to that, you do have this primeval chaos that God has to bring into order. So to me, it makes more conceptual sense than actually a specific textual hook back into Genesis 1-2. And I think this is it's the most reasonable trajectory to me, again, to my eye. So I think this last option of Beale has a lot to commend it. And of the options, again, I just think this is the best one to explain what's going on with the silence. Now you get to verse 2, and you get these 7 angels, which are also mentioned in verse 6. So I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. So the next question is, well, who are the 7 angels? Now, what makes this interesting is in Second Temple Jewish literature, you get 2 kinds of listings of archangels. Sometimes there's 7, sometimes there's 4. So it's not actually consistent. And so since you do get lists of 7 archangels, commentators have been sort of inclined to see a connection there. Let me just jump into Beale and McDonough. This is from the Beale and Carson commentary in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And they write, the 7 angels may be identified with the 7 well-known archangels of Jewish apocalyptic. So you get them listed, for instance, in 1 Enoch 20, verses 1 through 8, Tobit 12:15 is another. There's other places in 1 Enoch 81:5, 90, chapter 90, verses 21 and 22. Again, these are sort of well-known. And Beale and McDonough continue, they say, it is tempting to identify them, though, with the 7 guardian angels of the 7 churches in chapters 2 and 3. So that's a second option. Angels as divine agents executing the plagues follows the trajectory of biblical and Jewish tradition that angels were appointed by God to perform the judgments against the Egyptians, especially at the Red Sea. There are hints of this, and he cites Exodus 12:23 and Psalm 78:49 through 50, and then a few targums at different Exodus passages. Targums are Aramaic translations that sort of insert the angelic idea. Personally, I again, this is where I'm going to land here. I don't think it makes much sense to align the angels here, the 7 angels that are meting out the judgment, with the guardian angels, the angel patrons of the 7 churches in chapters 2 and 3. Because if you did that, that sort of makes it sound like the churches are somehow in the mix of meting out or dispensing judgment, which is pretty contrary to what's going on in the book. I mean, the church is the one suffering. They're in no position to mete out judgment. I mean, God is, but they're not. So it doesn't really seem coherent, to my ear and my eye. I think the 7, points to the completeness of the judgment, the thoroughness of it. After all, it is the day of the Lord. Like there's not going to be anything left to do, after this is over. It is a total decreation. I think the 7 number helps to communicate that. And I do think there is something to the connection to the Exodus angelic agents being, again, agents of the plagues back in the Exodus story. I think that's the better trajectory in light of what follows, because the first 4 clearly resemble the plagues. Again, we'll hit that in the next episode. But let me just read Psalm 78:49 through 50, just so you get an idea of what that passage is actually saying that Beale references here. In Psalm 78, again, this is sort of a reiteration of the history of Israel. I'm going to go all the way back to verse 42. So we're going to end up in 49 and 50, but here's verse 42, Psalm 78. They, the Israelites, did not remember his, God's power, or the day when he redeemed them from the foe, when he performed his signs in Egypt and his marvels in the fields of Zoan. He turned their rivers to blood so that they could not drink of their streams. He sent among them swarms of flies which devoured them, and frogs which destroyed them. He gave their crops to the destroying locust, and the fruit of their labor to the locust. He destroyed their vines with hail, and their sycamores with frost. He gave over their cattle to the hail, and their flocks to thunderbolts. Here's verse 49. He let loose on them his burning anger, wrath, indignation, and distress, a company of destroying angels. He made a path for his anger. He did not spare them from death, but he gave their lives over to the plague. But then in verse 51, it switches back to he, God, struck down every firstborn in Egypt. And I mention this because in my Angels book, which I know some of you will have read, Psalm 78:49 does not say that destroying angels killed the firstborn. So we have a distinction here. The death of the firstborn, again, ironically, specifically, is accomplished by the mashkit, the destroyer. And here in Psalm 78, it's God. And how can they be the same? Because the mashkit, the destroyer, is the angel of the Lord. Again, this is what I discuss in my Angels book. 1 Chronicles 20. Again, there are passages where the angel of the Lord, who is God, in human form. There are passages where the angel of the Lord is a destroyer. He is the one who dispenses judgment, in God's stead. And so you have these passages basically say two things. The destroyer is God, and the destroyer is this angel, and so on and so forth. So that's consistent theologically, again, in light of the two powers in heaven, the two Yahweh figures that I write about, an unseen realm, and of course the book on angels and stuff like that. So we don't want to get that confused, the destroyer, singular, with destroying angels. Those are two different things, but they're related. The angels that are referenced in Psalm 78 are associated with enacting the plagues. So they become agents in some way of the judgment of the plagues. But the death of the firstborn is attributed to Yahweh as the angel. So again, I think Beale is picking the correct trajectory here, that the destroying angels here in the book of Revelation, especially since when you actually get into the trumpet judgments, mimic, at least the first four of them, mimic the plagues on Egypt. This is probably the best trajectory, to go back to what happened in Egypt. And in Psalm 78, when it's talking about what happened in Egypt, you have a company of destroying angels. And so we don't necessarily have to identify them as the specific seven archangels. Again, that terminology is not used. But I think the best way to understand this in light of the Old Testament is we have a company of destroying angels just like we had in Egypt, and the number 7 is used to denote the completeness of it, the utter decreation. Again, it is the day of the Lord after all. There's nothing left to do. Let's move on to 8:4, Revelation 8:4. Let's just pick up with verse 3. Another angel came and stood at the altar with a golden censer, and he was given much incense to offer the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. Here's verse 4. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rose before God from the hand of the angel. So we have reference here to the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints, which of course rose before God from the hand of the angel. Beale and McDonough write, prayer as incense in the Old Testament connotes a prayer accepted by God. That's Psalm 141, 1 and 2, Numbers 13, 18. Divine acceptance was also indicated by the fragrant, quote, smoke of incense, unquote, in the Old Testament temple. It's Leviticus 16, 12, and 13. In the Old Testament and the New Testament, incense was always associated with sacrifices. Incense was added to the burning of the sacrifice in order to make it acceptable to God, such as that on the Day of Atonement, for example, Leviticus 16, 11 to 19. Other references, Exodus 29, 18, Leviticus 2, 1 and 2. Revelation 8, 3 through 5 echoes Leviticus 16, 12, and 13 in the Septuagint, where we read the priest will, quote, take his censer full of coals of fire off the altar, which is before the Lord, and he will fill his hands with incense, and he will put the incense on the fire before the Lord, and the smoke of the incense will cover the mercy seat, unquote. Similarly, Exodus 30, verses 8 through 10, virtually equates incense with burnt offering and meal offering and links it directly with the Day of Atonement. The point here is, Beale and McDonough say, is that the Lord hears the prayers of his priestly people. Remember, who are the priests in the book of Revelation? They're believers. And the believers in the book of Revelation are the ones being martyred, the ones who are suffering. So the point here is that the Lord hears the prayers of his priestly people, just like using the Leviticus imagery for the Day of Atonement. connects those prayers with the prayers of these Old Testament figures, which God accepted. And back to Bela McDonough. And the Lord answers with devastating judgment. Consequently, the Leviticus and Exodus portrayals serve as analogical precursors for Revelation 8:4. And that's the end of their quote. But since the specific referent is the Day of Atonement, again, that's going to matter as well, because just think about the imagery. Think about the imagery, that we've just talked about. Hey, we've got, after Revelation 8 verse 2, really the rest of the book to Revelation 22:5 is the content of the scroll. It's all this apocalyptic judgment stuff. So the world is going to be decreated, and then it's going to be recreated again into a new Eden, just like what happened in Genesis. There's a chaotic beginning, chaos. God brings order to the chaos. He produces a habitable world for humanity, and we get the garden in Eden. So we have the same process going on. And what is the Day of Atonement for? If you think back to the Leviticus series, I used this analogy, which should be familiar to everyone. It's hitting the reset button. And if you remember the sacrifice that occurs the Day of Atonement, Aaron kills a bull because that's going to purge him of defilement, because he's going to have to enter into sacred space. And on this day, he even enters the Holy of Holies to sprinkle blood, on the mercy seat, because the two goats that are taken, the one that's sacrificed is never sprinkled upon Israelites or the people corporately. That blood is sprinkled upon the tabernacle, the objects, these holy objects, including the mercy seat. Why? It's to decontaminate them, to purge them, to essentially restore them to pristine condition as they were at the very beginning of the construction of all these objects, when the whole Levitical system was first created and instituted by God. The Day of Atonement is a reset button. And if you look at it that way, it makes sense to have the Day of Atonement specifically referenced here in Revelation 8, as if to say, God has heard the prayers of the suffering his people. He is going to deal chaos a final death blow. This is the day of the Lord. The wicked are going to be decreated. In fact, the whole earth is going to be decreated. All of those who are preserved through this, who will make it to the other side, the new Eden, are going to be the righteous. They're going to be the Lord's. Okay, everyone else, this is their end. There's going to be everlasting life for the righteous and everlasting death for the unrighteous. Okay, there's a clear demarcation point. And when you emerge on the other side, you get to a new Eden. It is as if, again, it's as if there had been no fall, there had been no evil, there had been none of this stuff. It is a reset button. It is Eden as it was intended to be. And to use the imagery of the Day of Atonement, trappings, the ceremony there, would be a good conceptual way of communicating the point of the reset. Everything is going to be decreated. Yes, it's going to be awful. It's so horrifying that there's silence in heaven. But on the other side, everything is going to be restored and renewed to what God originally wanted it to be. And so these hooks back into these Old Testament themes, and in some cases, specific passages, whether it's Exodus or Leviticus or whatever, are important for communicating ideas. Even the company of destroying angels, that takes people's minds back to the plagues in Egypt, which were a precursor to what? To deliverance of the people of God. Taking them to, it was the initial stage of arriving at and in the promised land. Okay, so all these themes are important, again, to sort of cast what's going to happen in imagery associated with the judgment of the gods of Egypt. Okay, that was the major force of chaos in the life of God's people. It was Egypt, because God's people were living where? In Egypt. Okay, the descendants of Abraham are in Egypt, and so chaos and the gods that create it, that help create it, is destroyed. They're dealt with. they are judged, and then God's people are delivered. Again, so that's one set of images. The other set of images is the Day of Atonement, the reset button. Okay, all these things are important to sort of help communicate ideas about what's being revealed in the book. So that brings us to 8:5, and this will be the last verse I comment on for this episode. We have, then the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar and threw it on the earth, and there were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. Now that language ought to be familiar. Beale and McDonough again write, this is the last judgment. The fire results in thunders and sounds and lightnings and quakings, which is an almost identical expression for a description of consummate judgment later in the book, in Revelation 11:19 and Revelation 16:18. The fourfold metaphorical chain of cosmic disturbance has a precedent in the Old Testament where it also refers to divine judgment. And look at the passages: Exodus 19:16 and 18, Psalm 77:17 and 18, Isaiah 29:6. Okay, Exodus 19 ought to be ringing bells with Sinai. I mean, we've seen this language before in association with the presence of God, God showing up at Sinai. Beale and McDonough continue, since the formulaic phrase concludes the series of trumpets and bowls by referring to the last judgment, the same formula here likewise must conclude the series of seals. What that means is, let me just stop there. Those later references in Revelation 11:19, 16:18, you're going to see the same language wrap up the series of trumpets and the series of bowls. It's going to sound the same way. So what Beale and McDonough are saying, it's here because it concludes the series of seals. So when the seals are done, you get this thunder, lightning, quaking, language. When the next series is done, you're going to see it again. When the third series is done, you're going to see it again. So back to Beale and McDonough. The Sinai theophany of Exodus 19:16 to 18 is partly in mind in 8:5, since it was part of the illusion, if not the primary one, earlier in Revelation 4:5, which we've talked about quite a bit in those episodes. The virtually identical phrases in Revelation 4:5, 8:5, 11:19, 16:18 to 21 are all Sinai allusions. And so, again, Beale and McDonough comment, the portrayal of Revelation 8:3 to 5 is also modeled to a great extent on that passage and also looping in Ezekiel 10:1 through 7. Ezekiel 10:1 through 7 is important because there we get an angelic figure standing in the heavenly temple and is told, fill your hands with coals of fire from between the cherubim, presumably from the altar, and scatter them over the city of Jerusalem. This comes immediately after the narrative of Ezekiel 9, in which the angels were commanded to slay all the unfaithful in Jerusalem, upon whose foreheads God's angel did not place a protective mark. And we've been through some of that before when we talked about Revelation 4, so we're not going to rehearse that here. But again, you get the same feel. You've got Day of the Lord imagery. You've got it married to Sinai imagery because this is a way to communicate the presence of God, the wrath of God, God being the agent behind all this. It's God seated on his throne. In Sinai, it's on the mountain. Okay, here it's the heavenly temple. It's the heavenly abode. Back at Sinai, it was this earthly abode on this particular mountain. Okay, so this is John again. It wants to communicate all of these ideas. The deliverance of his people, okay, preceded by the judgment, of the gods of Egypt, the judgment of chaos, and so on and so forth. The deliverance of his people, they're coming to, again, a place. In the Old Testament, they wind up at Sinai, and God makes a covenant with them with this same Sinai imagery, the thundering and the lightning and the quaking and all that stuff. But God is not their enemy. God is the one who loves them and enters into a covenant with them. I mean, people are scared because, we've covered this in the Book of Exodus series as well. But they actually enter into a covenant there. And here, by looping this in, it's like, okay, God's remembering his covenant. He has heard the prayers of his people. He's going to do it all over again. He's going to judge, the agents of chaos, whether they're human or supernatural. He's going to decreate everything, but he's also going to recreate. He will remember his covenant. He will remember those who are his, and they will emerge once the reset button is hit on the other side in the new Eden. Again, this is really Revelation 8, 1 through 5, 1 through 6, kind of sets up not only the decreation stuff from, this point on to early in Revelation 22, but it also sort of sets up what follows, that when you get the vision of the new Jerusalem, the new Eden, the global Eden, all this, the new earth. It sets up all this stuff thematically. And so this is a good place, again, to stop, because next time we'll take a specific look at the plagues and their similarities to what's going on in Egypt. And then, again, there are a couple of these judgments, the trumpet judgments. Again, the first 4 of these, essentially the plagues of Egypt all over again. But there are others that are different, again, that take us into more, if I can dare say it, more supernatural territory. So what you get is the first 4 trumpets are going to be modeled on the Exodus plagues against Egypt. In essence, they're a reenactment. It's what was done to Egypt all over again. Plus, that helps us see sort of a new Exodus deliverance for the people of God. They're the ones that are going to survive on the other side. The righteous are vindicated the day of the Lord. But chapter 9's 5th trumpet, believe it or not, is oriented by the fall of Hillel ben Shachar. Okay, the shining one, the Lucifer figure, okay, if you will. There are connections to that one in the 5th trumpet. And also the judgment of the watchers in the abyss. That happens in Revelation 9 too, in conjunction with these judgments. There's a lot of demonic imagery in the last 2. Let's just put it that way. A lot of supernatural cosmic powers of darkness imagery in the last 2. So that's what we're going to hit next time. We'll go through all 6 of them that occur in these 2 chapters. And again, hopefully by listening to this introductory part, you can kind of see where things are going to go, and the logic of what parts of the Old Testament are sort of brought into play to help us sort of understand what's going to follow, and really help the reader understand, what's going to emerge on the other side of basically the world being annihilated. I mean, because that's what the apocalypse is. That's what the day of the Lord is. So it sort of sets up what God is doing. It's not random destruction. The apocalypse itself, the decreation itself, has a goal. Okay, things are going to get reset, and again, that's what's going to play out in the rest of the book.
Well, hey, we're still in Revelation 8.
And people might have noticed, by virtue of the title, that we are not going to get into chapter 9 today. We're going to finish chapter 8, so we're going to, move into chapter 9 in its own episode, because, once I got into this, it's like, there's just too much stuff here to talk about, so I'm not going to try to, weed things out just to get through. So we will finish verses 7 through 13. Again, that's the rest of chapter 8, and these are the first 4 trumpet judgments, so that's what we'll cover today. And again, the focus here is to cover them in their Old Testament context. And so a lot of the discussion today is going to involve in some way the plagues on Egypt. You recall from the Exodus series that we did that the plagues were directed against Egyptian gods. And so consequently, there'll also be a couple of references to the Deuteronomy 32 worldview in this, which I suspect is going to be pretty unique in terms of how Revelation anywhere gets talked about. So we're going to go through the 4 trumpets, and again, just with an eye toward what is John, what are the visions, that he sees, what are they hooking into as far as, Old Testament imagery, and what might that mean? What might that suggest? So the first trumpet is Revelation 8:7. I'm just going to take these as we go through and just read the passage. Again, I'm reading ESV. The first angel blew his trumpet, and there followed hail and fire mixed with blood, and these were thrown upon the earth. And 1/3 of the earth was burned up, and 1/3 of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. Now, there's an obvious correlation here with the plagues of Egypt. You've got the hail and the fire mixed with blood, so on and so forth. And Beale and McDonough comment this in the Old Testament, in the New Testament commentary that Beale and Carson edited. This verse is patterned after the Egyptian plague of hail and fire in Exodus 9:23 through 25. Specifically, in the Septuagint, you have a strong correlation, overlap in the language, which reads, "And the Lord gave hail and fire upon the land, and the Lord rained upon all the land, and there was hail and flaming fire mingled with hail, and hail struck in all the land." You notice land is mentioned repeatedly there. "And the hail struck all the vegetation in the field, and the hail shattered all the trees in the field." So it's a little You get a little bit of added detail there when you reference the Septuagint here. And Beale and McDonough go on to note, both Exodus 9 and Revelation 8:7 present an affliction of hail, together with fire sent from heaven against three parts of creation, the earth or the land, and the trees and the grass. And although the trial from Exodus has been limited in Revelation to two of its effects, to 1/3, it has also undergone universalization. Now the affliction has effect throughout the whole inhabited earth, whereas obviously in Exodus it's on the land of Egypt. Now, the third wording here isn't really as transparent as to its context. Okay, going back to Revelation 8:7, 1/3 of the earth was burned up, 1/3 of the trees burned up, all the green grass was burned up. So you have this third idea in there a couple of times. And where that might come from, again, isn't very clear. So Tonstad, in his commentary, says that there are so many threes, as you go through Revelation 8 and these trumpets, that it's kind of pointless to look to one Old Testament passage. And then he proceeds to say the most important third is going to be later in the book, Revelation 12, third of the stars. And then he proceeds to interpret this third and others by the third of the stars in Revelation 12 cast down. I don't know why he does that. He actually doesn't bother noting that passage's connection to Deuteronomy 8:10. So they're good guys. It's not like a judging evil or anything like that. And he doesn't argue for an identification specifically at all about the third of the stars, but then he proceeds to filter everything else through the dragon. Again, honestly, his approach just doesn't make sense to me. It seems arbitrary. But I thought I'd mention it. He'll come up again later on when we go through different trumpets, where I think he's tracking on things, something a little bit better. But a more common approach to the third language is reflected by Owen in his commentary, and he writes, the eschatological destructions of 1/3 of various parts of the cosmos, which is a consistent theme throughout Revelation 8, really 8:2 through 9:21, is loosely based on Ezekiel 5, verse 2, where you get this language three times, Revelation 5:12 three times, where three different fates befall each third of the population of Jerusalem, represented by what Ezekiel does to each third of the hairs of his head and beard. So and again, this is common, thinks that the third language has something to do with Ezekiel 5. Well, that makes more sense than Tonstad, but honestly not a whole lot. It amounts to using the third judgment language on Israel back in Ezekiel to describe the judgment of the world here. Now, Beale doesn't rule out a connection to Ezekiel 5, but other things he proposes, I think, are more simple. He says in one place, and this is his commentary, in both Exodus 9 and Revelation 8:7, hail and fire are sent from God against three parts of creation, earth or land. You can translate it either way, trees and grass. Revelation modifies the Exodus plague in that now only 1/3 of the land and the trees are harmed, yet the affliction of all the grass remains unchanged. That would be similar to what goes on in Egypt. He continues, though the limitation to 1/3 may be carried over from the previous clauses, as is more clearly the case in Revelation 8:11b. Although in one sense the trial has been thus limited in its effects, it has also been universalized again in that now it has effect through the whole inhabited earth. And so then he goes on to offer another possibility, that, again, drawn from the Old Testament, not Ezekiel 5. He writes, Revelation 8:7 might also evoke Zechariah 13:8 and 9. And I'm going to just read that so that listeners can get a feel for that. Zechariah 13:8 and 9. In the whole land declares the Lord, 2/3 shall be cut off and perish, and 1/3 shall be left alive. And I will put this third into the fire and refine them as one refines silver and test them as gold is tested. So if we actually go back in Zechariah 13, again, this is a judgment. Okay, it's a judgment on really what's going on, in terms of Zechariah's timing. I mean, this is either exile or post-exilic, and it's really talking about Day of the Lord. And so you have a judgment, but then you also have 1/3 that's spared. So if that's the case, Beale writes, this is at the end time, there's a fiery judgment that will affect thirds in Israel. 2 parts will be cut off and perish, and 1/3 will be left in it. And I will bring the 1/3 through the fire. Beale says both the righteous and godly suffer the same trial, but the trial positively refines the righteous, but only punishes the ungodly. So that, might have a little bit more, to do with things. It might fit, again, the context of Revelation 8 and 9 and going on through the book. about the righteous and the unrighteous, again, are affected by these plagues, these trials, but the righteous aren't going to be the ones that are destroyed, that kind of thing. So they're refined through the process, or they will be brought through it in some way. So that feels to me like a bit of a better fit. There's another factor, though, and that's a structural one. That's going to become a little more relevant when we get to Revelation 9. I may mention it again, but I'm just going to throw this out because it's kind of interesting. Steve Moyes, again, in his book on Old Testament Revelation, observes how the trumpet judgments in Revelation 8 and 9, and even some material in chapter 10, follows the themes of Joel and Amos, like consecutively. What he means, he has a little chart in his book, and I'll try to relay this, but if you look at Revelation 8, 6 through 13, so that's what we're covering today in this episode, the first 4 trumpets. There's fire and sun and moon, judged, and that's what happens in Joel 2. If you keep going into chapter 9 in Revelation, you get these locust scorpions, okay, smoke and locusts. Well, that happens in Joel 3. See, Joel 3 follows Joel 2, so Revelation 8 and 9 seem to track on Joel 2 and 3. You keep going in Revelation 9, you get what Moyes calls this a lion cavalry, lions and fiery horses. And lo and behold, those are mentioned in Amos 1 and 2. And then on into Revelation 10, you have an angel of an oath and a mystery revealed to the prophets. And you'll actually read about that in Amos 3. So John is apparently in 8, 9, and 10 following Joel 2 and 3 and Amos 1 through 3, just in the ordering of things. And so that's probably going to be of some use in terms of the context of what's going on, especially when we hit Revelation 9. But taking that here, that might be a good Old Testament context for this language. And so we have maybe Ezekiel 5, maybe Zechariah 13, maybe Joel 2 has something to do with this. And one last note, particularly for those who might favor a recapitulation view of Revelation as opposed to a linear chronology reading of Revelation. Beale adds this note in his commentary. Revelation 8:7 also echoes Ezekiel 38:22. Remember, that's the Gog and Magog passage, which refers to the final end-time defeat of Gog by the Lord. I will judge him with blood, sweeping rain, and hailstones, and I will rain fire on him. Doesn't that sound like Revelation? Sounds like Revelation 8, okay? Jewish exegetical tradition, Beale comments, used Ezekiel 38:22 in connection with the hail plague tradition of Exodus and applied it to end-time events. So you say, well, why bother mentioning that? Well, as we're going to see as we keep going through the trumpet judgments, there's going to be similar language repeated, okay, in several of the trumpet judgments on into Revelation 9. And remember, there's this big debate about how we should read Revelation. Is it a linear chronology of events? That's typically the way like a dispensationalist would be taught, or explain Revelation. It's a linear chronology. Other views would say no. You have cycles of repetition. Okay, you have sets of things that just roll through those and then they repeat themselves. And so the book is not designed to be read as a linear chronology. There are repetitive factors, and that affects, for instance, when you get to Gog and Magog in Revelation 20. Well, maybe some of that imagery actually already occurred, and so we don't have Gog and Magog of Ezekiel 8, following a 1,000-year millennium. Maybe the millennium is really, again, the church on earth, and some of these judgments, Gog, Magog, again, all these trumpets and stuff like that, actually are things that are happening to believers and unbelievers simultaneously on earth, and they just keep getting recycled. They just keep getting described in slightly different language throughout the book, so that you can't, here's the point, so that you can't establish a, quote, end times chronology from the book of Revelation. Like, it's just impossible to do that because it's not to be read as a linear chronology. So again, that's the kind of stuff, if we were talking about end times views, we would get into, but I thought it was worth observing here because you're going to see this language repeated a lot. So let's go to Revelation 8, 8, and 9. Really, let's just go through Revelation 8, 8 through 11, and trumpets 2 and 3. We're going to take them basically as together, because trumpet 3 is largely repetitive of trumpet 2 in terms of some of its language anyway. So I'm going to read this and you'll see what I mean. So Revelation 8, 8, the second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea. And a third of the sea became blood, and a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. Verse 10, this is the third trumpet. The third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is wormwood, and a third of the waters became wormwood, and many people died from the water because it had been made bitter. Now, obviously, there's repetitive, very similar language between both of those. This great mountain falling into the sea, and then sea becomes blood, and then creatures die, and then the next one is great star falls from heaven, falls on the fresh water, springs of water, and then people die, and the water's poisoned. So there's obviously some overlap here. The plague references is really the sea turning to blood. That draws our attention right back to Exodus. That one's kind of obvious. The third trumpet, the water becoming bitter, kind of harkens back to the incident at Marah, where the waters were made bitter, Exodus 15. Again, this is following the Red Sea crossing. And between them, there's really little appreciable difference. And so Beale's commentary, he has some things to say here about kind of the overlap and, really that these two things can be read together. So with respect to trumpet 2, second trumpet, he writes, the likeness of a mountain could be metaphorical for a kingdom, as it is elsewhere in the Apocalypse, in the book of Revelation, and in the Old Testament more broadly, and in Jewish apocalyptic writings. And so he references Revelation 14:1, 17:9, 21:10, a few other things. Fire in the Apocalypse and elsewhere is an image of judgment. Consequently, the burning mountain connotes the judgment of an evil kingdom. This meaning is supported by 18:21, where, quote, one strong angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, unquote. The angel immediately interprets the symbolism of his own action. Thus will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence and will not be found any longer, unquote. Revelation 18:20 also interprets this to mean God has pronounced judgment for you on your behalf, the saints, against her, against Babylon. So let me just stop there. What Beale's saying is this throwing this big stone or this quote-unquote mountain into the sea. He says there are passages where there are similar language to that, both within the book and outside the book, where this mountain thing is actually a kingdom. And he draws attention to Revelation 18, where it's Babylon. I mean, you could also go back to Daniel, and you have the stone made without hands. That's actually the kingdom of God. I mean, again, there are other references like this that take let's just say it this way, cosmic mountain imagery, and relate it to either God's kingdom or the kingdom under some other deity. All right. So he just wants to make his readers aware that sometimes this language gets used of actual kingdoms. So back to Beale, he says, Jeremiah 51:25 refers to Babylon's judgment this way. This one's very clear. I am against you, O destroying mountain. Okay. I mean, Babylon's called a mountain there. And I will make you a burned out mountain. Again, the language is pretty explicit there. Let's see. He says, note likewise 1 Enoch 18:13 and 21:3, in which the preliminary judgment of the fallen angels is spoken of as, quote, stars like great burning mountains. Again, that language is used of fallen supernatural beings. Okay. That this judgment is alluded to in Revelation 8:8, Beale writes, is apparent from the repeated allusion to it in the seventh trumpet. See note on 11:18b. Okay, we'll get to the seventh trumpet later because it's in a later chapter. And also from Jeremiah 51:27, blow a trumpet among the nations, quote unquote, which is a signal to gather armies against Jerusalem. Later in the same oracle of judgment, Jeremiah speaks of a scroll of woe written against Babylon tied to a stone. Here we go again with this big stone imagery of Babylon, and thrown into a river. Jeremiah interprets this symbolic action by saying, so shall Babylon sink down and not rise again. And so Beale says, here we have the basis of Revelation 18:21, which we just read. So he says, therefore, the picture of Revelation 8:8 did not originate from an attempt to depict a literal volcanic eruption or some other natural phenomenon occurring in the first century or predicted for later. A literal reading is rendered unlikely here and throughout the visionary section by the simple observation that the catastrophes are inspired primarily by Old Testament literary models that contain figures of speech. This does not mean that such models could not have been used to describe literal disasters, but the burden of proof is on those who hold to a literal understanding in addition to a figurative perspective. The destruction of ships here anticipates the description again in Revelation 18, so it's going to be repeated later on. just like the mountain stuff. We're going to see the ships destroyed, okay, in Revelation 18. There it's the complete destruction of the, quote, great city Babylon, again pointing back to Babylon, which was the source of maritime commerce. Every shipmaster and all who sail anywhere, and every sailor and as many as work on the sea, cried out when they saw the smoke of her burning, and they were weeping and mourning, saying, Woe, woe is the great city, through which all those who have ships in the sea become wealthy because of her wealth. It's Revelation 18:17 through 19. The seafarers mourn because they realize Babylon's destruction entails their own demise. There may be in 8:9 an implicit idea of the shortage of water, since that was a major effect of the Nile turning into blood back in Exodus 7, which would intensify the picture of maritime disaster here. But the aspect of the Exodus background is expressed explicitly only with the third trumpet. The judgment of the great city, the great mountain, Babylon the Great, results in famine, which affects part of the entire world, here the sea, and the sea is figurative for unbelieving peoples later in Revelation 17:1 and 15. But that may not be the cause here, or the case here, because 8:9 continues with a description of what was in the sea. On the other hand, in the light of the influence of Jeremiah 51, it is probably no coincidence, that Jeremiah 28 in LXX describes Babylon's demise with the metaphorical picture of a sea that has come up upon Babylon and she is covered. Now, again, Beale goes on for quite a bit, demonstrating, again, that the language, here's his point, the language in Revelation 8, you're going to find repeated in Revelation 18 and some in 17. And if you trace that back to the Old Testament, in all these places, it leads to one destination, that is Babylon. This is about the destruction of the world system, i.e. Babylon, that is hostile to God and his people. That's what the trumpets are about. And he's saying, look, if you're going to take the Old Testament imagery seriously, you're not going to be postulating, an asteroid impact, or something like that, for wormwood, that this is what's commonly out there in the internet, that either this refers to a volcanic eruption in the 1st century, or we're going to get hit with an asteroid later, or something like that. He's saying, look, we have all this Old Testament imagery here used in this chapter and then repeated, where this language is repeated in chapter 18. Again, we have references that clearly go back to Babylon in the imagery. And that makes sense if we're reading the book of Revelation, because these are the trumpet judgments. They're judgments against the people who have been persecuting God's people. I mean, how much more obvious could it be? And Babylon itself is going to be mentioned in the book of Revelation as the entity or city or, supernatural force, the cosmic Babylon behind this persecution. And so those people, the people of the nations, and their gods are the ones who are subject to these judgments. And that goes all the way back to the Old Testament, where Babylon is Babylon is the poster child for anti-Eden in the Old Testament, cosmic evil. And not only that, but where do we get the nations and their gods to begin with? Aha, Genesis 11, Deuteronomy 32, Babylon. Again, it actually coheres really well if we pay attention to the Old Testament imagery. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to be able to sort of figure out, like, okay, what exactly precisely is being described here. It's not going to answer the question of, should we be preterists now or should we not? Because again, those questions are tied to bigger questions about the date of the book and things like this. And Beale, Bill was what he would call an idealistic amillennialist. He's not going to be like in the preterist camp. He doesn't live there. But again, you get the idea. If you ignore, I hate to say it this way, but if you ignore the Old Testament connections and read Revelation simply as a linear chronology, you're not going to get any of this. It's all going to just be invisible to you. Let's go to trumpet 3. Again, we're taking 2 and 3 in tandem, and Beale has a few things to say about third trumpet specifically. Here, Beale actually gets into what we would recognize as Deuteronomy 32 worldview language. And you might ask, well, how? And the answer to that is the language for fallen divine beings, i.e. fallen stars, gets married to judgment of the earth's nations. Just, this is Psalm 82, Deuteronomy 32. So Beale writes, with the third trumpet, the judgment of famine appears to be continued. The misery of foul, undrinkable water implicit in the second trumpet is brought to the fore. Therefore, Exodus 7 still stands in the background. Again, the plagues as is also evident from the statement here that, quote, rivers and springs of waters, unquote, were affected. And that's the wording drawn from Exodus 7:19. The similarity is enhanced by Psalm 88:44, which paraphrases the Exodus plague by saying that God, quote, changed their rivers, plural, into blood, and their streams, that they should not drink. So Psalm 78:44, let me just break in here, which describes the Exodus plagues, is actually a really, really close parallel to both trumpets 2 and 3. It covers what happens there. Back to Beale. He says, as with the second trumpet, so again here a great fireball is thrown from heaven. This time it is not depicted as a great mountain, but as a, quote, great star burning like a torch, unquote. If this is a continuation of the similar judgment of the first two trumpets, then the fire can again be understood as a metaphor of famine. We have observed elsewhere that stars represent angelic beings in Revelation, the Old Testament, and post-biblical Judaism. These angels themselves often corporately represent earthly peoples. Again, that would make sense. And kingdoms. That would make sense. Again, Deuteronomy 32 worldview. And fire symbolizes judgment in the apocalypse and other related literature. The same must be the case here. As in verse 8, we see here the judgment of an angel who is a legal-like representation of sinful people. Again, these are the gods of the nations. This is Deuteronomy 32 worldview thinking. Now, what's interesting here is Beale actually finds this in rabbinic literature. He says the Midrash Rabbah for Exodus 9:9 interprets Exodus 7:16 through 18, that plague on the waters, which is still in the background of Revelation 8:10, as a judgment on heavenly beings. Like rabbinic Judaism actually saw this. It interprets this plague, the plague on the waters, as a judgment on heavenly beings, just like Revelation's doing. In other words, in that case, it's the Nile deity, who are legal agents, this is Beale's language, who are legal agents representing sinful people, the latter of whom are likewise affected. Isaiah 24:21. This is a passage that should be familiar to those of you familiar with, again, what I write, Deuteronomy 32 worldview, day of the Lord judgment, combined with Deuteronomy 32, thinking. Isaiah 24:21 is adduced in support of Midrashic interpretation. Quote, the Lord will punish the host of heaven on high and the kings of the earth on the earth. So there you get both. Again, Mike isn't making this up. There it is right in the rabbis, where you have Isaiah 24 describing a judgment of not only earthly armies, but those supernatural beings which correspond to the punished nations right there in the same passage. Okay. So he references another rabbinic text, commenting on Exodus 12:2 for the same thing. He says, so similarly, Midrash Rabbah, Exodus 23:15 affirms that both the Egyptians and their guardian angel, again, this is rabbinic language, patron angels associated with the nations. Let me just stop here. What's really striking about this is that a lot of this rabbinic stuff, now catch this, this is going to be really important to some of you out in the audience, because I always get this, the traditional Hebrew text, doesn't say that the nations were allotted to the sons of God. That's the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint. We're going to stick with the traditional Hebrew text, regardless of whether it makes sense or not. We're just going to stick with it because it's the Masoretic text. What do you think the rabbis in the early medieval period are using? They're using the traditional Masoretic text, but they still have this theology. Lo and behold, they're still catching it. Now, that either suggests, and I've made this comment before, the idea that there is one Masoretic text that every Jew after 100 AD followed slavishly and just, bought what the council of rabbis who decided to standardize the text, bought what they were selling. That is not true. Within the Jewish community, there is still a multiplicity of texts, and I'm willing to bet, because the theology comes through real nicely here, in the Jewish community, I'm willing to bet that the Deuteronomy 32:8 reading of Qumran did survive, in the minds at least, of some people, if not the texts. It's still there. The theology is still there one way or the other. Now, I've referenced Abdewitzer before. It was a German scholar who collected all of the citations of the Hebrew Bible in rabbinic writings. It's 7 volumes. It's in German, unfortunately. And if you look at his work, it makes the point that the rabbinic community, the Jewish community, the serious community, the rabbis, okay, that we all like to talk about, the rabbis, they were quoting Hebrew Bible texts that in places do not align with the Masoretic text. They had their own preferences. There are variations. So I'm just saying, here it's no defense. You can try to retreat from the theology all you want. But, we can whip out here some rabbinic texts that have the same Deuteronomy 32 worldview in them and say, well, what about that? Check that out. So let's go back to Beale. Again, he's commenting on Midrash Rabbah, Exodus 23, affirms that both the Egyptians and their guardian angel were judged at the Red Sea. The Egyptians and their guardian angel. Gosh, where are they getting that? This interpretation is supported by 1 Enoch 18:13. How dare he invoke Enoch when commenting on rabbinic texts? But he does. 1 Enoch 18:13, 1 Enoch 21:3, which describe the judgment of fallen angels as, quote, stars like great burning mountains, and 1 Enoch 108, 3-6, which borrows the same image to portray the punishment of sinful people. Again, this association of punishing fallen angels, quote unquote, with people, like marrying those two things together. Folks, that is the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. That's what it is. It's the Psalm 82 worldview. Back to Beale. Revelation 8:10 appears then to portray judgment that people and their representative angels endure throughout history, and that precedes their final condemnation at the end of history. The burning star could, on the other hand, represent merely an agent of divine judgment. However, the observation that the descent of the burning mountain in verse 10 is parallel to the descent of the burning star in verse 8 also indicates that the star should be identified as an angelic representative of an evil kingdom undergoing judgment. Here, the judgment of Babylon's angel is in view, since verse 8 concerns the judgment of Babylon the Great. Okay. Let's transition a little bit to wormwood. I want to say a few things about this. What about the terminology wormwood? ESV Study Bible has a note. Wormwood, the Greek is absinthos, is the name of a plant and of the bitter tasting extract derived from it. Artemisia absinthium. Now, the curious thing is there's no direct Septuagint use of this Greek term. Might sound surprising, but it's true. And so this is not Beale. This is Silva. Moises Silva is the editor. I don't know who wrote the article off the top of my head, but this is from the New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology and Exegesis. It's a multi-volume word study resource. And we read there, the form absinthos is not attested prior to the New Testament, although it occurs twice in Areteus, a medical author from Cappadocia, who lived in the 2nd century AD, and then mainly in Christian writers thereafter. In the classical period, this word occurs in the form absinthon, Hippocrates, for example, and other medical writers. It refers to Artemisia absinthium, a herbaceous perennial with silky leaves that bears masses of small yellow flowers, and it yields a bitter dark oil that is sometimes used medicinally to kill intestinal worms. Isn't that pleasant? In Jewish literature, neither form occurs in the Septuagint, but Aquila uses it to translate a particular word, le'ana, in Proverbs 5:4. Let me just reference Proverbs 5:4 so that we can sort of think back to it here. Proverbs 5:4, in the end she is bitter as wormwood. And so we have the word translated in English here, wormwood, is la'ana, which in Aquila, again, this is an early writer that has a relationship to the Septuagint, but he's not the point of origin for what we think of as the Septuagint. He does use absinthos. Okay, so there's some correlation. We're gonna see Proverbs 5:4 again in a moment. The problem is, back to Silva, that here the affected water causes death, whereas wormwood, at least as we understand the term, is bitter, but not poisonous. The author may have in mind a different substance that was genuinely poisonous, or he may be employing a way of speech not uncommon in antiquity, whereby bitterness and poison were connected. He may be reasoning from the bitterness of the taste to the bitterness of the results. This fits in also with the fact that in the Old Testament, wormwood or gall is used of God's punishment of the wicked. I will make this people eat bitter food, la'ana. Again, that's the same word found in Proverbs 5:4 and drink poison water. So Jeremiah 9:15, I think it's 14 in the Septuagint, I will make this people eat bitter food, la'ana food, okay? So that's wormwood or gall, again, which is kind of interesting because, of the reference to Jesus and the cross and what they offer him and what he refuses and so on and so forth. But anyway, Beale goes on. Let's bring Beale into the picture here. That was Silva. He writes this: the metaphor was chosen to show that judgment was well suited to the crime because the prophets figuratively polluted Israel with idolatry. So God is pictured as polluting them with bad water. In other words, the prophets bring judgment against Israel because of their idolatry. They bring out its pollution. And so God, again, is sort of returning the gesture, the favor. In other words, it's referring to the bitterness of suffering, and the suffering is well deserved. This figurative meaning is confirmed from the indisputable metaphorical uses of the word everywhere else in the Old Testament, where it also represents severe affliction resulting from divine wrath. Deuteronomy 29:17 and 18, again connected with idolatry. So la'ana there is connected with idolatry. Proverbs 5:4 we've already mentioned. He has a number of other citations: Amos 5:7, 6:12, Hosea 10:4. Again, there are places in the Old Testament where la'ana, that word depicting bitterness, connects it to suffering, and it also connects it to idolatry. And so what Beale is saying, this concatenation of associations is how we need to go back and look at what's being written here in Revelation. So Beale comments again. He says, likewise in Revelation 8:11, Babylon, the prevailing world system, has influenced the earth dwellers and some in the covenant community to become idolatrous. And the consequences of such idolatrous pollution is judgment on both Babylon and those held under its sway. Against this Old Testament background, the third trumpet does not unleash a woe in which water becomes literally poison. Rather, the tone is one of judgment that brings bitter suffering, including death, and not only on the outsiders to the covenant, but also on the purported members of the community of faith that turned to idolatry. They're all going to suffer bitterly, is Beale's point. Again, using it metaphorically. Beale adds one more thought. The judgment of poisoning water with wormwood in 8:11 conveys the idea of famine and so continues the theme of the preceding two trumpet woes. This is in line with the ideas seen in early Jewish writings. So this connection with famine, look, if your plants are burned up, and if the water that waters those plants, is made bitter or poisonous to those plants, guess what? You're not going to have a lot to eat. That's the connection with famine, which again, goes back to the Old Testament and the whole Egyptian situation as well. Let's go to trumpet 4. Trumpet 4 in the transition to chapter 9. I'll read the last two verses of the chapter. The fourth angel blew his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of their light might be darkened, and a third of the day might be kept from shining, and likewise a third of the night. Then I looked, and I heard an eagle crying with a loud voice as it flew directly overhead, Woe, woe, woe to those who dwell on the earth at the blasts of the other trumpets that the three angels are about to blow. So that one's looking forward into what is yet to come. So in verse 12, the fourth trumpet is at least in part an allusion based on Exodus 10:21 and 22, the plague of darkness over Egypt. Again, Egypt was the persecutor of God's people, and it lasted 3 days. Recall from Exodus and our series there that the plagues were directed again against Egyptian gods, and none more noteworthy than this one, the blotting out of the sun. Okay, just think how solar theology was so important to Egypt, and this one would have really freaked them out. Early Jewish literature, for example, the Wisdom of Solomon, and this is in the Apocrypha, or if you have an English translation of the Septuagint, you can find it there too. So the Wisdom of Solomon in particular, that material interpreted the plague of darkness to have symbolic significance. Exile from the true God, prisoners of darkness. Amos 8:9 is also likely part of John's reference, in that case a judgment on apostate Israelites patterned after the plague on Egypt. The fourth trumpet language may harken back to the creation account, though, as well. Now, this is a little bit of a different thought. It's obvious to see, a connection back to the Egyptian plague, the plague of darkness. But On and a few other commentators wonder about there might be another antecedent in the Old Testament, and they go back to the creation account. Here's what he means. He writes, "It is perhaps not mere coincidence that on the fourth creative day, God is reported to have created the sun, moon, and stars. This is Genesis 1:14-19. So that the cosmic destruction that occurs here, Owen writes, can be understood against the background of the creation account. So what he's getting at there is a situation that reverts to pre-day 4 chaos. Okay. Elsewhere, Owen notes the ancient Jewish context of the mid-heaven terminology. Okay, in some of these passages. So if we go back to I'll just continue with on this. It's Revelation 8:13 for the sake of this passage. It's going to come up again a little bit later, but let me go to Revelation 8:13 again. Then I looked and I heard an eagle crying with a loud voice as it flew directly overhead. Okay, the overhead terminology there is actually mes uranema. So uranos in Greek is heaven, mes is midst. So it's actually a term that means mid-heaven, directly overhead. If you think about the imagery, you look directly over your head, the sun would be like right in the middle of the sky. So it's mid-heaven. You say, well, who cares? Well, Owen is going to comment on this terminology, and he sees something interesting here. He says the noun ta mes uranema, mid-heaven, occurs 3 times in Revelation, 8:13, 14:6, 19:17. The term also occurs on a magical amulet, probably of Jewish origin, with a sun, moon, and 2 stars on the obverse, and this inscription on the reverse: one God in the heavens, who exists and who pre-exists, who is greater than all, who dominates all the beings in mid-heaven, unquote. It's kind of interesting. This position of dominance also makes the reference to the eagle interesting. So what he's basically saying is the mid-heaven term was the place. It's the center of the heavens, and at the center of the heavens is the place from which God rules everything in heaven. That's the idea. So now he's going to move from that, and then he's going to talk about the eagle. So Owen writes, the eagle was regarded as the messenger of Zeus. This is me now talking, as in earlier references in Revelation 1, be a usurpation of Zeus's most high status. Let me just stop there. Go back to the amulet, the mid-heaven, amulet, the most likely Jewish amulet that is talking about Yahweh, one God in the heavens. Look at who exists, who is, and who was, and is greater than all. Who exists, who pre-exists, and is greater than all. So that God, again, is mid-heaven. He's the one who actually controls things. And then the eagle reference, again, regarded as a symbol of the messenger of Zeus. No, it's not the symbol of the messenger of Zeus for John. It's the symbol of the messenger of the God of Israel. Because the God of Israel is the one sending the angel, okay? So this is actually a kind of an oblique way, again, it's taken a shot at Zeus's claim to be most high. It's kind of interesting, so I thought I'd loop that in here. It's a bit obscure, in terms of maybe first century Jewish cosmology. It's not technically Old Testament. But again, it's another swipe at Zeus, which we saw back in Revelation 1:4. John do this a couple times. Now, Pilch and Malina is a name familiar to the podcast audience. He's the one who did the book on astral theology and Revelation. The book is called On the Genre and Message of Revelation. He has a co-author, Pilch. They're both New Testament scholars, and they wrote a separate book, a social science commentary on the book of Revelation. And they note this about the astral theological worldview context of the mid-heaven and the eagle and all that. They write, as we have previously noted, the word translated here as mid-heaven, mes uranema, is a technical term in astrology and astronomy. The eagle in this context occupies the position of the constellation Pegasus. Its location in mid-heaven points to its significance. This is because, and they're going to quote Firmicus Maternus, who is an ancient astronomer. This is because frequently, or rather always, in all charts, the medium, the mid-heaven, holds the principal place. Again, this is sort of like the center of the universe idea. Earlier, in discussing Revelation 4 and the heavenly creatures full of eyes, in the same commentary, Pilch and Malina wrote this: stars are called eyes. Because of this, the 4 living creatures full of eyes would be constellations. We covered this back in Revelation 4. But to continue, he says, full of stars, both here as well as in Ezekiel 1 and 10, give us in this scenario it seems that in this scenario, they would bear the throne on their cosmic backs while the front of their eyes faces outward. So if you think, let me just stop here. If you think of the four cherubim, if you think of their constellations, they're going to be facing outward. And then, the back parts of them are going to be facing inward. And then atop them is where the deity sits, and so on and so forth. So just get that image in your mind, these four constellations, and so on and so forth. So they write, the four constellations, both here as well as in Ezekiel, are the four Babylonian seasonal constellations: Scorpio, Leo, Taurus, and Pegasus. Pegasus, a constellation which a Babylonian inscription calls the, quote, leader of the stars from the divinity Anu, unquote, namely refers to the stars of the equator. This constellation was the Babylonian Thunderbird, the flying eagle, to be identified with the constellation called Hippos in the Greek sky. This constellation occurs again in Revelation 8:13. So this is the eagle they're saying is the Pegasus, the flying eagle here in astral theological thinking. In Babylonian lore, this is traceable to the 7th century BC. Pegasus is the leader of the stars along the celestial equator, just as Aries is the leader of the stars in the ecliptic. Thus, each of these constellations bears a royal star, that is, enough to prove their special significance in Greek astronomy and astrology, which follows Babylonian sources in this case. These four constellations are likewise depicted in a Babylonian source as designating the four directions of the sky, for they lie about 90 degrees from each other. In this position, they duly circumscribe the whole vault of the sky, and in our scenario, the references to the throne of God would refer to the whole of the sky. Furthermore, since these constellations stood at the equator opposite each other, the phrase, quote, in the middle of the throne and around the throne, unquote, makes sense, for the equator both cuts the sky in half and goes around it. Now, what's the point of bringing their commentary from Revelation 4 into Revelation 8 with the mid-heaven thing and Pegasus and whatnot? If you're thinking on these terms and then you read Revelation, you realize that what John is doing. John is saying that no, the Greek pantheon, Zeus or whoever, again, the eagle being a symbol of Zeus, this mid-heaven, Pegasus that's supposed to be like this marking that where Zeus's throne is. John is basically taking all of that and not throwing it in the dumpster, but he's saying, no, we're going to kick Zeus off the throne here. We're going to take Zeus out of this position. The constellations that map out time and all this sort of stuff, they were created by God, okay, the God of Israel back in Genesis. He is the one, just like in Ezekiel 1, who sits on the throne and controls the course of time and history. Again, this is like Ezekiel 1 messaging tucked away in one verse in Revelation 8. That's the whole point. Again, if you have this kind of thinking in your mind as a first century pagan or even possibly a first century Jew, if you were interested in this sort of thing, astronomy, you would know all these things, and you would have been exposed to the religious significance of the terminology in a first century Greco-Roman astral theological worldview. And John is basically just wiping Zeus right out of the picture. That's the point. So in terms of John's theology, the judgment of Babylon and its gods is what's happening with the first four trumpets. Zeus isn't on the throne. His Babylonian equivalent isn't on the throne. The God of Israel is on the throne. The God of heaven, and also the God who is Father of the Lord Jesus Christ, who is going to punish those who are persecuting the people who are loyal to him. And again, that he's using all this messaging, taking our minds back to the Old Testament, specifically the judgment of Babylon, because Babylon was the primo persecutor of the people of God in the Old Testament. They're the ones who took Judah, the royal dynasty, into exile. They're the ones that destroyed the temple. Okay, they are ground zero for anti-Eden chaos thinking. All that is opposed to what God wants. Okay, they just wiped out. And they did it under the sovereignty of God and punishment for Israel's apostasy. We get that. But they still bear this label. And so here in Revelation, John is dipping into, in terms of both symbology and also quotations about Babylon from the Old Testament that fit right into, again, the Old Testament judgment now being transferred into the enemies of God in the book of Revelation, who are getting what they deserve. just to reinforce the notion of who's in control, that would be God, and who is going to be punished. Well, it's the people on the boots on the ground people who persecute the people of God, and their gods are going to be punished. And why you say, well, what about Egypt? Why would Egypt get looped into this? Before Babylon, which nation was the nation that was the major force of chaos that persecuted the people of God? That would be Egypt. Okay, it's a repetitive theme. The supervillain changes. Okay, Egypt, and then it becomes Babylon. These are the two focal points. And if you think about the birth of Israel, in terms of being brought out of Egypt, passing through the sea, entering into a covenant, a renewed relationship with God at Sinai. Well, that's where things, sort of begin again, post Abraham. I mean, Abraham's, obviously the person God chooses to, raise up Israel as a seed, as a new humanity. And again, even Abraham has Mesopotamian origins, possibly Babylonian, depending on where Ur is. But you see the Babylon thing or the Mesopotamia thing, then it's Egypt. Now it's back to Babylon. All these episodes sort of telegraph the conflict between what God wants, the Edenic relationship, to be God among His people on earth, okay, and what happens, what happens to the whole plan. It gets destroyed. Why? Not because God wants it destroyed, but because of disloyalty. Okay, unbelieving disloyalty, the opposite of believing loyalty. That's why it happens. Apostasy, moving over to some other god. And it just gets repeated here in Revelation, using the same Old Testament themes. So again, if we're not, if we're reading the book of Revelation and we're using a newspaper as our commentary, and we're reading it in linear fashion only, again, my view is that both things happen. There's both recapitulation and there's both linear. But if you're reading the book of Revelation with Meet the Press as your commentary, or the newspaper or something like that, and you're blind to how the Old Testament is used by John, all of this is invisible. All of this is invisible. You're going to be talking black helicopters and asteroid hits. And that is just not the point. It's just not the point. So again, what we're trying to do in this series, and what we'll continue on with in Revelation 9, we pick up the other, at least 5 and 6, the trumpet judgments there, is to at least encourage you to look up some of these references. The cross-references in your Bible are there for a reason. Okay, because scholars who produce these things in committee translation projects, these cross-references are supposed to help you, locate the context, or at least a parallel to what's being said in your translation. And when those cross-references lead you back to the Old Testament, chances are high that has some importance for how we should interpret what we're reading in the New Testament, in this case, the book of Revelation. But anyway, next time we'll pick up with Revelation 9. Everybody likes Revelation 9 because of the locusts and all that stuff. And if you've read Reversing Hermon, you already know, I think this has something to do with the release of the Watchers and whatnot. But that'll be in the next episode as we pick up with the next 2 trumpet judgments and tackle that chapter.